So now you have to pay reciprocal tariffs on the non-declared steel and aluminum content. That wasn't expected. That was out of the blue, and they added some extra tariff numbers, which now it looks like maybe they pulled back on. There was some done a mistake, and it's so you get these pieces of information sequentially, sometimes not always in the right order, and you're supposed to rip and run and figure out what to do with it. I mean, who can run a business, right? Who can make a compliance decision in that world?
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're in for another show at Simply Trade Podcast. Lalo Solorzano and Andy Shiles here, and I'm going to tell you, we are in for a good discussion today because we're going to get to have a talk, if you will, with one of my favorite folks. Really, actually, his wife's even better, but we'll settle for Jeremy here.
Hey, I know where I stand. Don't worry about it.
There you go. But Lalo, I'm excited. You got this guy booked for us and all that. Before we get going too far on this, but what seems to be the latest on from your perspective on the Global Training Center and anything with the courses, anything that's seems to be a hot button that people are signing up for?
I don't know. It's mostly everyone wants to know what they can do with whatever is going on with the current trade situation. I guess trying to keep up with everything that's going on. We hired Cindy Allen to put together a program that can help with that. But I guess what I try to tell people, I mean, it's not really trying to understand what you're doing today or what's going on today. It's mostly going back to the basics and learning and understanding the foundation of everything, like knowing how tariffs work and making sure that those tariffs, what I mean by tariffs is tariff numbers. I mean, like classifying your products correctly, having a solid foundation there instead of just throwing a number at a product because you think it's okay or someone told you that that's the right number. Free trade agreements. Go back and revisit that, things like that, those are all foundational and things that we always like to teach. And they'll hold true whether it's an aggressive trade environment like now or a little bit more chill environment like it was in the previous administration or whatever, and something in between. It doesn't matter, that's just been our perspective, so that's what we're seeing right now is people coming to us on that. And, we kind of just trying to talk them off the ledge just per se.
People get a little anxious and all. I will say to our listeners, listen, especially if you are in upper management or in any kind of management role, you need to make sure that you got a solid foundation with your people, that they are proficient with knowledge and skills. And so that, get them trained, let them do recurrency training, all that kind of stuff, so that when you're in the heat of battle of a situation and something comes up, that's not the time to go, well, let me go back and start learning here and all that. You need to get these people prepared now so that when the appropriate situation comes up, they can step up and deal with it. So anyway, Lalo, thanks for that. And I will say we have now, again, I mentioned one of my favorite people is Jeremy Page from Page Fura. And he has his lovely wife was Shannon Fura, and they have the Page Fura Law Firm, trade attorneys up in Chicago. You're still up there, I assume. All righty. So we're going to get to talk to Jeremy today and pick his brain on a few things. Welcome, Jeremy, once again. You've been on the show several times and just love you to death. You've got a fantastic family, and just I'm so thankful that you're on with us. You're good friends with Lalo and me both. So,
Yeah, no, thank you guys for having me. You talk about being on multiple times. I'm not quite to the SNL 5 spot, right? That's the when you cross that threshold of Saturday Night Live. You've been there 5 times. Yeah, but we don't have any musical act with us either, unfortunately. They're all booked. We tried, but although I don't know if I'd be playing anything uplifting or spiritual or what these days, given everything going on. But yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Well, so what seems to be, I mean, everybody's sick and tired of the tariff talks and all that, and they're stressed out to beat 60. And yet at the same time, have you seen some things going in going, what were they thinking? Or what is like, oh my gosh, it's like, don't do that. Don't do that.
So you're starting with a lob, right? A nice, easy, slow pitch for me to hit. But this one I can hit pretty far, I think. Yeah. I mean, look, we're all living this dream right now. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it. I think your one point earlier is so critical that, we always talk about the need for an educated community, right, within your organization. And it's not just your trade compliance people. It's the functions beyond, not to make them experts, but to sensitize them and make them knowledgeable at some level. And, a lot of times other functions would pay kind of short shrift to that, right? Yeah, that's not my role, blah, 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 blah. No, we would just be like, hey, give us 30 minutes, tell you why purchasing is important or accounting is important, how you overlap with trade, any other function. And, you get some receptivity to that. And you do that and you'd say, why don't we weave something into your procedures just to say if something happens operationally, reach out to trade, this and that, and a lot of it fell by the wayside. Of course, today we're in the exact opposite world, right? Everyone wants to be engaged. Everyone wants to be an expert. To some degree, they're relying too much on things like ChatGPT to find an answer, which is really scary. But at least tariffs with a capital T is everywhere, right? I mean, when you see the Wall Street Journal masthead and there's a whole separate section that you call tariffs and you click and, everything emerges. It's, every day on the front page of every paper, there's tariffs. I mean, the commercials online, like who is it for? WeatherTech, right? Their products are made in the US and they had a picture of if you've seen the commercial, it shows all these ocean going vessels out in like some port, they're all docked out there waiting to come in. And it goes, these ships have two things on them: goods coming to the United States and tariffs. They go, our products, and then it flips to them. Our products are made in the USA. I'm not challenging that assumption, but presumably it's all US sourced, all whatever, the requirements for made in USA. But it's just to see, this, and how many articles or advertising do you see now? Buy now before the tariffs go up, right? I mean,
that's the big one now. It's like, you better buy them now before, the next shipment coming in,
right? All the lumber, they're waiting for the 232 to drop and things like that, right? So all the, hey, it's time to do your home improvement project, get out there, and so, but it's healthy in a wonderful way because it does bring us to the table. It's exhausting in another way, right? When it comes down to it, right? And I, the real challenge, of course, is the speed with which things are being implemented, right? I mean, we got a telegraph stealing one of the most recent example, right? You got telegraphed on last Friday. Was it last Friday or the Friday before? No, I don't know. I can't remember. When, President was at U.S. Steel and he announces kind of on the run, we're moving up to 50%. And then they come back and say, okay, it's going to affect June 4th, right? So I guess it was last week. So, everyone's waiting. What's it going to mean? Is it really going to happen? Nothing, everyone's refreshing the White House's website over and over, looking at some Truth Social or whatever else you follow as your medium of choice. And it hits like 5 o'clock at night. Out comes the announcement. 5 o'clock, June 3rd, going into effect. This is 5 o'clock my time. So like 6 hours later, this is going into effect. And guess what? It wasn't just the 50%, but now we're going to change the rules on content. So now you have to pay reciprocal tariffs on the non-declared steel and aluminum content. That wasn't expected. That was out of the blue, and they added some extra tariff numbers, which now it looks like maybe they pulled back on. There was some done a mistake, and it's so you get these pieces of information sequentially, sometimes not always in the right order, and you're supposed to rip and run and figure out what to do with it. I mean, who can run a business right? Who can make a compliance decision in that world?
Well, to your point, this is one of those where all companies, I mean, around the world, quite frankly, but all companies have had where, you've had your objective set for the year, you've had your budget set for the year, you've got everything going, and everything in 4 months' time has just been completely destroyed. And so now everybody's in this shock and awe and trying to figure out, it's like, you know what? You got to be able to be adaptable here. And it's really I guess I come back to you've got to focus on what is your fundamental focus of your business, and make sure you got a good solid foundation. And then with all the other stuff, yes, it's affecting you, but you've got to be agile to handle this stuff. And it's really put a lot of businesses in, dire needs. I think there's been, this a freight recession, if you will, in the trucking industry and whatnot for the last couple of years, actually. And there have been a lot of trucking companies that have gone belly up. There's been some regulations that I personally didn't care for, but we're seeing the effects of it. And so there are companies that are either filing for bankruptcy or they're literally just closing the doors on the trucking side of things. Well, we'll see how all that pans out, or if there are others that are strong enough to absorb all that. But I don't know what the impact here is going to be. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. When you look at public companies, I mean, they've pulled back on their projections, right? They said that tariff uncertainty has limited our ability to forecast, so previous projections of quarterly growth and sales, of profitability, top line revenue, they're a lot of them have pulled back on what they, because they're also worried about somebody saying, well, we acted on your public information, right? So we've seen a lot of that change over the uncertainty. We have the constant battle of, will prices go up or not? Some companies have been very public about the fact that we can't absorb all these tariffs. The ones that are saying selectively we can't. Some of them are hedging their language. So I mean, there's uncertainty for everybody. Uncertainty for the markets, uncertainty for the people who are investing in companies, uncertainty for trade, for compliance, for everything. And that's the one positive, and the biggest positive to me is at least there's understanding at the C-suite level of the challenges that are being confronted by the compliance people, right? We're not in the, there was an environment where compliance was just considered as a cost, right? You don't add any value, or someone would, you get the one-time hit on drawback, right? You've set up a drawback program, you get the 3-5 year look back, all this money comes through. They're like, oh my God, we're going to count for this every year. We're like, time out. No. That's a one-time look back. We don't set that as our baseline every year anymore, So, but that was like when it was considered like accretive compliance. So, now at least, we're seeing C-suite people more say, all right, I understand there's uncertainty. I know that we have risk. To give me your best sense of where you think things will head. Right.
Well, and then to your point,
4:55 p.m. Here's what my answer is.
Well, and to your point, though, that's where I see that, Jeremy, is that the import-export compliance folks have become more strategic now in their, I guess, planning discussions and whatnot. And but here's something that I also will say. What I see in this is, all right, everybody talks about the angst on some of this and the changes, but I see some phenomenal opportunity. Now, I have always said, and I think most people agree, U.S. goods have not been treated fairly around the world for decades, no question. I've seen it with, whether it's, high tariffs on U.S. goods or non-tariff trade barrier type stuff and all of that. What I see now, there are a lot of there are a lot of countries that are looking for U.S. goods to try and, increase their purchasing of that in this trade negotiation. But, one of the things I see is any manufacturers, especially in small towns where you have small factories of different kinds of widgets, it could be plumbing, parts and things, electronics. It could be, parts for rail cars and things of that nature, or whatever it is. Aerospace parts are really big and all. But I'm talking the smaller towns and whatnot. The point being is I see opportunity where they have been focused in the past predominantly in just U.S. domestic economies. There are countries now open it up, and I see opportunities for U.S. exports.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm on the Illinois District Export Council, right? So, the decks are set up all around the country. You're appointed by the Secretary of Commerce. It ties up to the National Association. And that organization's role is specifically to help small and medium-sized businesses find opportunities for export markets, right? So they do, tied to the commercial service, all kinds of trade missions and introductory meetings. Countries come here looking for different types of products and things. So without a doubt, there are opportunities there. But, it doesn't happen overnight because a lot of companies who will do it, if they go anywhere, they'll first consider Canada or Mexico, right? They're going to go something that's more proximate, not have to navigate the oceans or air or whatever the consequence is. But there are companies who are doing that. The challenge for some, particularly smaller companies, is can they get there before the tariffs kill them? And we've got, I can tell you from, in the Midwest, and, there's so many small feeder companies that maybe do a specialized stamping or a casting or some kind of a smaller assembly that they can do nimbly with a workforce of 10 or 12 or whatever. And a lot of these were entrepreneurs, right? They were in a bigger company. They broke off, started their own thing. They saw a way to improve on a product, and they've created a nice niche for themselves. Steel aluminum comes in suddenly at 50%. I mean, they were barely absorbent 25, if that, right? They don't operate on big margins, these companies. They're very small margins. And, and so we've definitely seen some companies who we've tried to help navigate either through getting exclusions historically, whether it was a 232 or a 301 or what have you. They've had to close the door because they don't have the capacity. They don't have the built-in either one to negotiate prices. They don't have the market position to do that, right? They don't have leverage over their supply chain, or they just don't have the built-in capital to let them do that, or even to bring production back here, right? It's an investment to create a line, and there should be, whether they use like an SBA cutoff for small business or whatever, there should be like a floor below which these tariffs don't apply for certain types of companies, because that's the growth industry always. The smaller companies, right? I mean, they're everywhere. So yeah, I agree with you. There are great opportunities for those companies to maybe take advantage of outbound markets. And, there are tools to help them do that. But can they get there? It's like a race, right? It's a race of, as the money comes out, do I have a way to reinvest to help me do those things? And I don't think there's just, between the immediacy of the implementation and the lack of recognition of that pervasiveness of the small industry and small supplier sector and the need to protect and help them, those are the two pain points that are so difficult to overcome.
No, I was going to say, Jeremy, recently we had a guest on our show, and I guess I can ask you this way. Have you seen, or do you feel that some of these, whether they're small or large companies, it doesn't matter, have they been getting, I guess, let's just use the word creative, and bringing in their products? Because the reason I ask is because this guest made a point at how the Department of Justice has now made customs fraud their number 2 enforcement that they're going after, which obviously that means that they're seeing a lot more uptick on that, or they perceive, I guess, an uptick on that because of tariffs, et cetera. So I don't know, I guess just any sound advice or anything that you might have seen that, don't let this happen to you type.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I'll take your last little side comment. The hard thing for a lot of companies is it's not like the export where we have, don't let this happen to you, right? We have a publication that's updated constantly that gives you really nice anecdotal evidence to say, hey, here's the risk if you do X, Y, or Z. On the import side, penalty actions aren't publicized, right? I mean, setting aside if we go to DOJ and criminal or False Claims Act, there are definitely increase in those circumstances where we're seeing that happen. So there's some ability contextually for, compliance people to say, if someone were to propose something that would be a little sketchy, I'll take the negative version of creative that you said earlier. There's some ability to say, here's why we don't. In my world, like most of our clients have been with us for 15, 20, if not 30 years. That's not that's not what our clients are trying to do. Are they being creative? No doubt about it. But they're being creative within the bounds of what they can do. Create simple creativity. Can we renegotiate a price? Can we help the supplier absorb some of the cost? But then we have to ask the question, are they related or are they unrelated? Because if they're related, it's a different dynamic as to whether it's still a fair price, right? An arm's length price for customs valuation purposes. Can we look at first sale? I mean, everybody and their cousin is pitching first sale these days. And there are definitely opportunities if you structure it correctly. But, we're having companies say, well, I want to do first sale. And we're like, well, who's your supplier? Oh, we buy from XYZ in Wyoming. I'm like, okay, well, buying from XYZ in Wyoming is not a first sale opportunity. Maybe whoever they're buying from, we're like, well, let me explain first sale. It's a little different than what you seem to think, or, creating an agency structure. There's been a lot of things posted as well. And I, just as an aside, people should be very leery of a lot of things that are being posted on different social media sites, because there are a lot of people promising the sun and the moon or not accurately representing legal constraints as a lawyer that exist. And, you don't want to pour good money after bad. You have to be very careful. We do a lot of work in foreign trade zones. So, people are talking about, foreign trade zone, it's a salvation. You can avoid paying the tariffs, blah, blah, blah. Well, the way they've structured these executive orders is if you're distributing, maybe depends who you're distributing to. If you're manufacturing, not if you're coming into the US, Canada, or Mexico, you're not going to save those tariffs because you have to assign a certain status, privileged foreign, to materials when they come into the zone that are subject to these different trade remedies. And so, you can defer without a doubt. But steel and aluminum is heinous. Steel and aluminum, they said, normally if you assign a privileged foreign status to goods coming into a zone admitted, the date they're admitted fixes the date that the tariff applies. Okay. So, but for steel and aluminum, they said, oh no, it's based on when it's withdrawn for consumption. So even though I may have admitted something pre-June 4th, when it would have been 25%, when I withdraw it, like now, it's subject to 50%. It violates the notion of privileged foreign. So you have to be really careful about how zones are being proposed. There are some benefits, but be cautious. And so that's, when you talk about creativity, I think I've seen more creativity from the people pushing services than from the companies doing something. And that's the creativity that is not necessarily the positive creativity, and I think you have to be very jaundiced. We talk about C-suite or other functional areas becoming more knowledgeable or interested. We've seen clients where, maybe a purchasing function said, hey, I saw something online and blah, 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 we should be doing this. And you're like, hold off. And sometimes they start running without going to the compliance people. And so we've had compliance people who are suddenly brought into a meeting and it's like, and it's already run halfway down the hill. And they're like, I hate to be the wet blanket, but this is not going to work for us. So that's the creativity
right there. That folks, literally, listen to what Jeremy just said, is that, don't use your compliance people and bring them in at the 9th hour. Bring them in at the very front end. That's like you're going to bring them in way on down. There's a lot of money and effort and everything's going down the road to say, oh, this project's going to work. We can source here and all that, and money spent. And all of a sudden the compliance people come in and they're put in a bad situation going, this won't work. And they're like, oh, you always say no, whatever. And then you've got a scenario where you're going to have pooper scoopers at the end of the parade trying to clean that up. And it's like, bring them in on the front end and feed the beast, not clean up after it. And it's like, you'll have a positive scenario here. So bring these people in for a strategic planning session here with that. That is great, Jeremy.
Yeah. Like, we have clients who set up trade task force, whatever you want to call it, and compliance is the seat of the table. That to me is one of the best things you can do. Multifunctional, weekly meetings, whatever, however frequent you think you need to do it. But because these things change so quickly, weekly's not a bad idea, right? Because you have to have time to get traction and make something happen. The most dangerous thing is when there's a number thrown out. Here's how much we're going to save. And it lands on finance, the CFO's desk. Because now they're starting to think, because that's the way they think. They're thinking about numbers, right? I get it. Nothing wrong with the way they're thinking. But then you got to say, wait, we just had like a client who had already had all this internal discussion and said, oh, we're going to save $4 million because of the retroactive application of stacking. And so now we don't have to pay these multiple tariffs because, it's one or the other, as, based on the first set of stacking rules, not the revisions, another thing that came out of June 4th. And I had to go back to them and say, that's great, but the window you're talking about, auto tariffs weren't in effect. Oh. I go, but it said it relates back to like March 4th or March 12th, or one of the many dates that's been out there. And I'm like, yeah, but the auto tariffs didn't go into effect until April. Oh, so they were looking at it in isolation, the phrase, and you guys said it earlier, it's like, if you look at the 232 steel, if you go back and look at like the most recent proclamation, the legacy is 2018. And all of that is in there, right? They go through all these iterations. Then we did this, then we did that, then we excluded South Korea or the EU, Mexico and Canada, and then we changed it again, And so a lot of people see the most recent proclamation and they'll be like, oh, this is what we can do. I go, whoa, the other stuff's still out there. You have to build your whole base all the way up, unless they point blank say this overrides or this, in some cases, like there are some changes like that, like the stacking, right? No, that's not how we're doing it. We're changing it to this order, but unless they definitively say those other EOs don't apply, if they're giving you that legacy, that's still the backbone that you have to worry about. And you have to build on that, which is all the more reason, to your point, Andy, you need people who've lived and breathed this dream, maybe not from day one, but long enough to have become educated on how we got here, the different twists and turns along the way that get us to where we are.
That's the thing, though, is that you're building a network. We keep talking about, and that part of our show here is to hopefully challenge people to, all right, let me think outside the box here a little bit, or, let me look at something here and let me call some of the compliance people, or let me go down to their office and see what they're faced with and all that. But as you're going through that, develop that relationship and just have roundtable discussions. And from that is, if you include those folks in there, a lot of times the sourcing people can hear is like, hey, I've got a great line on, Vietnam right here and all that. And it's like, yeah, but you better make sure that the content is not just China and it's being shipped there and then assembled, because you're going to have the same problem. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. It was like, let's look at a different continent. Let's look at different things here. And I think it would be worthwhile to, to have that and have the C-suite. Literally, how many times have, C-suite people been with the compliance? But here's one thing too. Compliance people, transportation, logistics, don't bore these people with all kinds of minutia detail. They don't have time for that. That's probably part of the reason why they never come around, because you're like, oh, right. God, Anyway.
No, but you're right. But, origin is such an essential element here. Like, Lalo, you talked about, idea of transshipment, stuff that comes across. Andy, same thing about, what are you doing where? And there's no doubt that I think the government will look initially to next door neighbors, like to China, for example, right? They already were, right? 301. It's funny. We don't even talk, isn't it funny? We don't even talk about 301. It's just out there now, right? When we talk about all these trade remedies, it's like, oh, by the way, there's also the 301 that still applies, right? We're so absorbed in all the 232 actions and now IEPA that we all just kind of have moved on from 301. It's like the poor stepchild in the closet we let out for dinner on Thanksgiving. It's like, it's sort of there, but no one talks about it yet. It's a big hit already, right? So, but we grew up with that one, but it's so even through 301, obviously there was a lot of effort to resource, right? How much do I have to move to be enough so I can stay in China, but I can call it Vietnamese, or I can call it, or the biggest of all, Mexico, right? A lot of relocation to Mexico, and it's no different for these tariffs as well, right? You still have to be worried about those same dynamics. And, but the rules here are more nuanced. Like, it's based on what's called like the product of, which may not necessarily be, like USMCA. It could be just substantial transformation. What does it mean? There was one of the EOs, and I can't remember which one now, where I think there's two where they have language. One said substantially finished in the United States. I don't know if it was auto. I just can't remember off the top of my head. And I'm like, what the hell does substantially finished mean? So I actually wrote to Trade Remedies, which has been great. If you follow their FAQs, they do a really nice job of trying to update, although, they weren't ready, and who could blame them? No one was ready for the change in the reciprocal on non-steel content. So I haven't checked the FAQs the last couple of days. Maybe they've updated by now, but it still said on theirs that you don't pay, anything else if you paid on the content. But I wrote that to them. I go, what does that mean? And wasn't in the room with them, so don't get me wrong. They didn't answer it, but my guess is they're like, we don't know what it means either, because it's not illegal. I mean, is it supposed to be substantially transformed? I mean, there's also one about for auto, like final assembly. Well, what's enough to be final assembly, right? To change the rule and how the rules apply in the auto world. These terms, we finally had to define what subject to means, right? That was a big issue, right? There was a lot of debate that if I have a tariff that ostensibly applies, but I don't pay it because I meet one of the exclusions, am I still subject to it, but I'm excluded? But to start with, I would have been subject to it. And there was some interpretation that said yes, because it's like export, catch and release, right? I'm in, but I'm out. But the government, we thought a different perspective that, well, to be subject to, you must pay it. And that's where the government ultimately landed. So, again, different guidance from different people, but the lack of specific guidance from the government, because there was language that was in the EOs that got carried over to the Federal Register notice that made its way into CSMS, which wasn't interpretive, right? It was more implementing, and that's, that's the thing. Like, you've got to wait till, it's so hard because you're expected to make a decision at 12:01 a.m. Eastern, yet we don't have the information we need to make an educated decision. And, our concern, and this goes back to your fraud comment as well, is how is the government going to perceive, for how long of a window will they perhaps perceive an action taken by an importer as a lack of guidance or information that they could intelligently act on, right? Andy, you're old like me. We got this MOD Act, right? What happened with the MOD Act? We had this whole period of informed compliance, right? And it was lengthy. It depended upon the change. And then they let you know, now we're switching to enforced compliance. But there was a period of time where everyone was allowed to grow, to make mistakes. It wasn't an enforcement-oriented event because there wasn't enough information or guidance, the shared responsibility that we don't seem to have exist anymore, that allowed us to grow into these legal changes. Well, if you read the EOs, they're like, go after them immediately. Enforcement, right? The whole mindset is very enforcement-oriented. So, but if I don't have something that defines a term, all I can do is my best sense of what I think it means. I go back to subject to. Both interpretations reasonable, right, at that time, right? So if someone didn't pay it, you're going to say, oh, you didn't apply the stacking rules correctly or whatever. Well, you didn't tell us. What are we supposed to do? We did what we thought was reasonable care, which, of course, the government could have a very different definition of that. But why should I be, and I haven't seen it happen yet, and hopefully it won't, anybody get penalized because the rules weren't clear, right? To me, that's the ultimate defense.
Well, but to your point, here's it's like there's a lot of question marks on this. The government's moving very fast. They're upping the game as far as the enforcement. So instead of informed compliance, it's now enforced compliance, and with that, there's also, from what we've been told, is that fraud investigations are like one of the top issues for the government. Well, in that, now it's becoming criminal.
Right. But that requires intent, right? But, criminal intent is very different than civil fraud, right? It's a very different standard, right? And that's why usually you'll see, like, before the government moves, if they say they want to think something was fraudulent from a civil 592 perspective, they will defer doing anything until they go to DOJ first and say, hey, do you want to prosecute this criminally? Because they don't want to compromise the evidentiary standards, the way to collect information, to taint the evidence that collected because, they have to follow certain, protocols in terms of how they get information and what have you. So they'll pull back until like DOJ will say, no, we decline prosecution. And then they move on to the civil perspective, right? So I agree. Like, we've seen a massive increase in False Claims Act. There have been some big dollar collections over the last, 10 years that I think have increased people's interest in coming forward and, doing a key tam action or whatever. The government may take it over or not and, pursue recovery of tariffs. And, if you're to use lack of a better term, a whistleblower, you benefit in the recovery. Customs has their e-allegation website, right? Which they now have changed to trade violation. It's some, I can't remember what they called it, but it's the same principle, right? And it actually has different buckets now if you go on their website. Although it's interesting, at the summit, the CBP summit, they were talking about this, and I wasn't in this session, so I heard it anecdotally, third party, but that they were talking about people who would post these allegations. And you can either post anonymously or you can post it to your name. If you post it to your name, you'll be able to track what happens with your allegation. If you do it anonymously, you lose that visibility. So the gentleman from Customs made some comment apparently, and hopefully I get this right, that, if you decide to post an allegation and you identify yourselves, recognize that we may look at you as well. Because, essentially, if you're the one saying it, then we hope your house is in order, right? And then an attorney got up in the audience and said, you're basically giving people no reason to come forward.
I was just going to say, they just killed the motivation to say, I see something, there's something not right, but far be it from me, I'm not going to say anything.
Right. Or you just do it anonymously, right? I mean, whatever, see where the chips fall. So, but I think that's part of this challenging enforcement landscape is there's just such kind of a suspicion. Look, TFTA, Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. But, we talk about facilitation as sort of, and even, more recently, Customs as, it's very clear the message is enforcement. It's not so much partnership. It's not so much facilitation. It's a shame because there's a lot of opportunity to do things together. I mean, I feel for Customs because I think they've been sidelined from being at the front line. We talk about, I'll flip it on its head for what we talked about earlier. Trade compliance should be at the table for the organization. Customs needs to be at the table before these EOs are issued. And they're viewed in many ways, I think, more as an implementer than as someone who can add context and devil's advocacy, which is something that's very much lacking right now.
You know what? That you're making a great point that I hadn't thought about it, but they're probably Customs is looked at as an implementer, not necessarily a participator in the discussion. And CBP would be a good one on here's an idea. Well, here's what the impact would be, and being able to provide guidance on that. But
look, practical implementation. They're now increasing the number of lines on an entry line from 8 to 32. Right. I mean, because these individual goods coming in could have so many attributes now that, right? So they're rolling out increase to 32 lines. But to me, that's something you would want to have Customs say, guys, you're rolling all these things out. We need to change our system so we can even accommodate that. Right. So right now we've got to split entry lines into different attributes. And I mean, that's not a minor consideration because it goes back to collecting the revenue. Right. That's what it's all about. Right. So if you don't have the tools in place, how do you even effectively implement what you're trying to do?
I would hate to think that you're talking about the harmonized tariff numbers. They're talking about moving it from, it's 8 or 10. Actually, I guess it's up to 10 now, isn't it?
Now it's going to 32. 32. Yeah, they just announced CSMS that they've been testing it. And
I'd heard about that. I personally hadn't read on that, but can you imagine the classification requements, the skill in that to get it down to the right,
stack them in the right order? I mean, you have an order, you have priority. I saw someone posted a broker on the southern border said there was an entry they made, and last year it required eight like elements, 8 lines to it, the eight stack. Mm-hmm. They go, this year, the exact same thing required us to have 23 different identifiers. I mean, how much more
here's
time
the
that takes, the cost, everything.
Whoever put that forward has got to be somebody that must be, first off, they're not in the trade. They don't have any experience. They got to be straight out of school and into statistics and all that. The problem with that is, in reality, that's going to significantly slow down the entry process, complicated by exponentially. And then thirdly, it's going to be a case where just about any way you go, can you imagine the misclassification, or what the government said, we classified it this way, they're going to try a different way? Goodness.
No, it's a nightmare for everyone. To me, that's one of the, if I go anecdotal, I mean, and then to do an audit. How do you audit that as a company? I mean, how do you give them the data, to give the book of the data, say, no, on this line, we have 12 cents of aluminum content and 43 cents of steel content. So make sure you break, and you have to identify both, right? Oh, no, I'm sorry. And we have aluminum content from 3 different countries. So it's 12 cents here, 6 cents there, 4 cents there. Oh, and here's the countries of smelt and cast. Oh, and by the way, here's the melt and pour for steel. I mean, the complexity of an entry, it's not like the old days where you can do a database, right? We had a database, right? Part number, classification, right? Duty rate. It was pretty simple, right? If you had 301, you could bump it. You could figure that out if it was China. The good old days, right? Now, I don't think you can construct a database that it would be reliable and consistent, because you'd be updating it so frequently. And then your supplier, your purchasing guys will come in, as they should. We have a chance to resource. We can buy this part now from Serbia instead of from China. Okay, well, where's the steel coming from? I don't know. The supplier's giving us a finished part. We need to know where the steel's coming from. Is there any aluminum? Where's the aluminum coming from? Not only were they coming from, where was it melted, poured, smelt, cast, whatever. I mean, the complexity of getting information, or you default and pay it 100%.
Your point, let me just jump in here, because we're going to run out of time here. But I was going to say, Jeremy, part of this is why companies need to be involved in trade associations to really help look at some of these things and then push back and say, this is what the impact is, whether it's positive or negative or whatever. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that?
I think there's a level to which trade associations can go, and then the challenge becomes there become different interests for companies at some point, right? Because of their different footprints, right? So and because you have competitors in the same association, right? They're not competitive from an association perspective. They're definitely common interests. I mean, I think no one would disagree that we need to slow the ship down, right? I think that's a common platform, increasing to 50%, and for the most part, companies but we have companies who import and are domestic, right? Even the steel aluminum sector, right? I mean, they're not consistent with their views, and the unions aren't consistent with what they think is good or not good and within that framework. So I think associations will be very powerful. They have a better seat at the table oftentimes because of their broad representation. They oftentimes get an opportunity to be heard or speak that maybe a company doesn't. Or to the other part, many companies don't have a presence in Washington, so they have no government affairs opportunity directly, or they don't want to stick their neck out individually. And I get that, for sure. So I think associations, and there could be very great conduits of information. I think it's when you get to the hardcore advocacy level, it could be difficult because we'll have a splinter in terms of where the interests lie. But I agree with you, Andy. There is definitely some benefit to working with a group like that has broader visibility and accessibility overall.
Well, Jeremy, you've covered a whole lot of stuff. It's like I'm going to have to play this one back and to digest so much. Folks, I'm going to tell you, Jeremy, and we'll have his contact information with the show notes here. But if you've got a question, man, this is one of the firms that you need to reach out to say, should I, would I, could I, whatever, and on issues, and especially if you get an inquiry. If you start getting a CF-28, you better don't treat those lightly. That's a customs inquiry onto one of your entries or something. But anyway, any final words of wisdom on how to keep your sanity in the midst of all this?
I was going to say, I think you don't forget to invoke your other Chicagoan that got elevated recently, and he can actually bless your shipments and stuff like that for you, right?
Yeah, but he's a White Sox fan. I mean, I guess everyone has their flaw. Although I don't know if you saw Lalo. He was at the 2005 World Series. It's so cool. Yeah. He's but his mom is a Cub fan, so
Okay.
we get it. Okay, I'm still hoping for an audience when we get back to the Vatican at some point. But no, it's super cool. I mean, all Chicago, irrespective of his one flaw, we all have to have one. It's really cool for Chicago. The buzz is still out in the air for sure.
I love it. Well, listen, folks, we have really enjoyed the conversation today. I hope you have too. Like us, share us, look at us on LinkedIn. Definitely reach out to Jeremy Page. He's a great guy, and his firm is a phenomenal one. But I love these folks together. They are so smart. It's not even funny. It's just like they are so involved, and they're great to have a conversation with. They'll guide you in the right way. So, hey,
same back at you, Andy. You too,
yeah, Jeremy. Seriously, all the best to you and your family, and I hope things are going well. And anyway, have a good one, my friend.
Have a good one.
You too. Let's take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.